Mrs. Hudson and the Spirit's Curse is the first book in the Holmes and Hudson series by Martin Davies. As you can probably guess from the name of the series, this is a Sherlock Holmes spin-off, first published in 2002, I think, following Holmes' cases from the perspective of his housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson. There have been several iterations and reimaginings of Sherlock over the years, from the modern-day adaptation Sherlock to the American Elementary with Dr. Joan Watson, and even a Japanese version called Miss Sherlock. He has made appearances in Basil the Great Mouse Detective, Murdoch Mysteries, sort of, and Batman. This is the only one I've come across, however, that shifts the focus onto Mrs. Hudson. Not to say it's not been done before, just that I haven't come across one yet. The book is written as a memoir by Flotsam, or Flotty, who is rescued from a terrible situation by Mrs. Hudson and begins working under her as a sort of maid. When they enter the employment of Messrs. Holmes and Watson, however, they find there is more to do than just polish spoons and fold laundry. A new case is brought to Sherlock's attention by a young man, terrified for his life when he realises the Sumatran curse, which has already claimed several lives, has followed him back to London. But is it an evil curse, born in the dark jungles of Southeast Asia, or is it merely the evil actions of man? I found this book, and its sequel, in a charity shop the other day, and the only reason I picked it up was because it looked like a fun concept, and a fun concept it was, so full marks for that. I enjoyed all the little ways that Davies has made parallels to the original Sherlock Holmes stories. For example, this book is written as Flotty's memoir, with Flotty being Hudson's assistant, in the same way that Sherlock and his stories are written as Watson's accounts of their cases. I thought that was quite clever. There are other little Easter eggs as well. For example, at the end, when Watson is writing up this case, he calls it the Giant Rat of Sumatra, which is a reference to a throwaway line from The Adventures of the Sussex Vampire. Matilda Briggs was not the name of a young woman, Watson. It was a ship, which is associated with the Giant Rat of Sumatra, a story for which the world is not yet prepared. Davies isn't alone in using this tiny tidbit to write Sherlock Holmes stories, but I still think it was a nice thing to slip in. There were also a few little lines which are similar, but not the same, to some of Holmes' famous quotes. For example, Hudson says of a box of produce ordered by Sherlock and left to fester in the flat for 2 weeks before they actually move in, "When we have discarded the inedible, what remains, however unlikely, will have to be dinner." Clearly a take on the quote from the Sign of Four: "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." And later on, when explaining how she knew where Watson had gone based on the state of the larder, Hudson remarks, "One should never overlook the alimentary." Likely a reference to the often misquoted elementary, my dear Watson. I quite like the different ways in which Holmes and Hudson come to their conclusions. Holmes comes to insanely specific yet accurate conclusions from a few scant details, whereas Hudson comes to a clearer, more concrete conclusion based on common sense and, well, what's in front of her. The ordinary details instead of the unordinary. Some people find Sherlock a bit stupid in this book. He misses a few very obvious things, and Hudson has to explain to him at the end all the things that he didn't realise. And I understand the issue, and I suppose he has been dumbed down a bit, but I didn't mind it too much. The point of this series is to give an alternate reading. Watson still writes up the case at the end, but he has been told not to include the roles that Hudson, Flotty, or several side characters had, and to make it seem like Sherlock deduced everything for himself, so that the Sherlock in the Watson's write-ups, and therefore of the Doyle books, has had his intelligence and role somewhat exaggerated. And that's not to say that Sherlock is stupid, he's not, and many of his deductions are spot on. He just misses the simple occasionally, and the obvious in lieu of the bizarre. A good example is at the beginning. A letter arrives. Watson interprets the letter as simply a note written in haste by a man fearing for his life. Holmes looks at the paper, the handwriting, the colour of the ink and the wax stamp, and the time of day, and works out the age and profession of the writer and how long he has been in the country. All of which are correct. But Hudson takes a different, but no less correct interpretation. It's just far less impressive, though it transpires far more important. But I won't say what it is, because spoilers. I liked the characters overall. Sherlock is rather full of himself and fairly dismissive of Hudson and Flotty's contributions at first, but he's still kind to them and nice enough overall, just bogged down by a Victorian sense of women's abilities. Flotty is a good narrator, and I liked Hudson's stern kindness. Scraggs, the grocer's boy, is a likeable urchin who helps out. My favourite characters were probably Rupert Spencer, a young man interested in science, and his friend Hetty Peters, who's just so chipper and enthusiastic and really fun to read about. The only characters I really took issue with were Watson, who felt a little too ditzy in this, with very little to contribute, and two villains from Flottie's past, Fogarty, the evil butler, and his nasty sidekick Smale. They were just a bit melodramatic for my tastes. Finally, the mystery is alright, depending on what the target audience was meant to be, which I'll get to, but overall it was fine. A little simple, I suppose, due to the extremely limited list of suspects, when there are only about 3 or 4 names who come up in conjunction with the mystery, and then one of them dies and the other nearly dies. It doesn't take a genius to work out who's behind it. Honestly, the writing didn't do it for me. I suppose it was alright for the most part, and there were a few turns of phrase I quite liked, but it was overall quite wordy and long-winded. I think the author was trying to emulate the dense Victorian style of writing, but it just came across as a bit messy, and I did have to reread a few passages several times to understand what it was telling me, especially in the early chapters where it establishes things like Flottie's backstory and how she came to be at Baker Street. I also thought Flottie's backstory was a little overdramatic and unbelievable, but I'll get back to that. This book clearly needed a better editor because there were mistakes. Now, when I'm reading a book, I don't tend to look for mistakes. Sometimes I come across them, like a missing speech mark, but on the whole, it doesn't necessarily bother me, and I'm not going to blame the author for printing errors. But there are errors here that should not have made it into print. A few spelling mistakes here and there, more than I should have noticed in a published book, and grammatical issues. But there was a passage where I am convinced a line was missing because the dialogue doesn't make any sense. The word carcass is spelt 2 different ways within the same passage. The spirit which is meant to be exacting revenge on the characters is called Enoki, E-N-O-K-I. But then later on for an entire paragraph, the spelling is changed to E-R-O-K-I. Not just one, but it was in a few times in this paragraph it was spelt like that. And these are the sorts of mistakes that authors probably should have picked up on. And an editor definitely should have. The plot was a bit repetitive. There were too many incidents of characters stumbling around London streets at night under a thick pea soup fog. The first time is fine because it adds to the tension, but they do it again a chapter later, and then again, which makes for dull reading. I also found Flottie a little too damsel in distress. I like her character, and I suppose as a young 14 to 15-year-old, she is the most likely to be kidnapped, but it happens so often. There are other ways to add tension and raise the stakes. And the book was lacking in tension, which is strange for a book that follows an amateur sleuth. Now, this is probably why I tend to prefer amateur sleuths and cosy murder mysteries to police procedurals. Amateur sleuths can't necessarily use forensics, previous reports, ballistics, or post-mortems to inform their case. They rely on looking for other clues and talking to people. Miss Marple's main method is just reading people because she understands human nature so well. In doing that, the reader gets to know the suspects as well, and begins to care about them. Therefore, when trying to work out who done it, we're not just trying to work it out for the satisfaction of being right, but we become emotionally invested in it. I certainly begin to favour characters and end up hoping that so-and-so doesn't die or that so-and-so isn't the murderer, which for me raises the tension and the stakes. In this, the suspects aren't given that much time and the sleuths don't really talk to them, so I don't care about them. I want to know the mystery because I'm curious, but I'm not emotionally invested in it at all. And I know that Hudson and Flottie will be alright at the end because Flottie wrote this memoir as an old lady and Hudson has more mysteries to solve. So it just felt a bit empty. And finally, the book feels a little tonally confused. It reads like an advanced tween fiction book, and the title doesn't help. The format of name and the plot point just makes me think of children's books, probably because that's how every Harry Potter title is formatted. And the explanation at the end is quite over-explained, which also feels a bit kids' mystery, sort of Scooby-Doo. But then the book dives into some pretty dark and gruesome things. The way that people die in Sumatra is grisly, and Flottie's backstory is essentially the evil butler locked her up and only promised to let her go if she disgraced herself for him. And it's implied that he's also a pimp. I guess, on the side of being an evil butler, but it's never really explicitly stated. But that's obviously what it is, so it's strange having this subject matter, which is probably not appropriate for kids, but then censored as if it's written for kids. It's very odd. It's a fun read. Is it brilliant literature? No, but it is fun, and it keeps one's attention well enough. I suppose if it was a longer book, I'd be less forgiving of its flaws, but it's so quick to read that I didn't really have time to get frustrated. I imagine there's probably quite an even split between people who enjoyed it enough to read on despite its flaws and people who couldn't get past some of its worst points. As I said at the beginning, I do have the second one already, so I'll give it a go. One person on Goodreads did say that the second is better, and maybe Mr. Davies just needed the first book to properly get into the world and the characters before really exploring their full potential. But time will tell if I choose to go on to read the others in the series. More murder next week as I revisit the literary offerings of Reverend Richard Coles and see if he's improved with his second Canon Clement mystery, A Death in the Parish. Until then.